The impulse had become irresistible. There was only one answer to the fury that tortured him, and so he committed his first act of murder. He had broken the most deep-rooted taboo and found not guilt, not anxiety or fear, but freedom. Every humiliation which stood in his way could be swept aside by this simple act of annihilation: murder.
Hey guys, we're here for a very special episode of 1982. We're here with two distinguished guests here. And we have Nathaniel Thompson from Mondo Digital, did numerous commentaries. How's it going, Nathaniel?
Very well. Buongiorno. Thank you for having me.
And we're also here with Troy Howarth, who's done numerous commentaries on films as well, but he also wrote The Unsane Cinema of Dario Argento, a book about Dario Argento. How's it going, Troy?
Good. Thanks for having me.
Of course. Thanks for being here. So obviously we're going to talk about the Unsane movie itself, Tenebre. So yeah, let's just get into a little description, a little plot, and then we'll hop right into the movie. So, forced to return to his giallo roots after the financial failure of Inferno, Argento returns with a bang. Tenebre follows the story of Peter Neal, a famous American author visiting Rome, on a publicity stretch only to find himself in his novel the target of a deranged killer. So that's just pretty much as simple. Now this movie's like location, like Rome. It's such weird because I look it up all the time. It's Rome. It's like, but this isn't the typical Rome. It's in weird places like that. So,
well, couple things to say. First of all, it's often said that Inferno was a flop. It really wasn't. It did extremely well in Italy. It was a big box office hit in the Italian marketplace. It didn't replicate the worldwide success of Suspiria, which of course was a major success. So on that level, I suppose it was perceived as a little bit of a disappointment. But in the Italian marketplace, it was it was very popular. It was very warmly received. And yeah, I mean, it was a film that definitely, it kind of goes against expectations in the sense that Tenebre, obviously the title, which we'll discuss, suggests that it's a continuation of the Three Mothers thing, that it's going to be another supernatural horror film. It's obviously not that. So it is indeed a return to the giallo roots. What's interesting is after Inferno was finished in 1979, Argento was actually in the process of developing a project for Dino De Laurentiis, the big Italian film producer who had actually been trying to get Argento on board to do an adaptation of an Agatha Christie story, any Agatha Christie story, going back to the 1970s. And let's not forget 70s big time success with all-star Agatha Christie films like Murder on the Orient Express. So this makes perfect sense. Argento didn't really want to do something like that. So instead, he was developing a project called Beyond Death, which interesting enough, deals with the idea of cannibalism amongst the homeless community in New York, which I suspect was probably based on some of the things that he saw in New York City as far as the homeless community, the rather sad plight of the homeless in the city that he would have observed during some of the location filming in Inferno. So that was the script that he was developing for De Laurentiis, but De Laurentiis didn't like that idea. So that quickly ended. And so, yeah, we come to Tenebre, which was actually conceived as In the Eyes of the Killer, which is sometimes listed as an alternate title for this film, but it was never released that way. It was always Tenebre, or, Unsane, as it would later be rechristened. As you say, it is set in Rome, but it is a kind of... he's always described as being sort of vaguely science fiction-y, futuristic film. This is my Blade Runner. I don't know about that. That's a little bit much. But what he decided to do was to avoid all the usual tourist traps. We don't get the Spanish Steps. We don't get any of the usual stuff that we see in most Rome-based films. Like before with Deep Red, for example, that was set in Turin. So, embracing Rome, going to the filmmaking capital in Italy, for the locations. He shot a lot of it instead in the EUR district, the EUR district, which was kind of a high-class, very sleek, very ultra-modern kind of concept that had been originally developed by Mussolini back during the fascist regime, and then it wasn't really sort of finalized and developed into the 1960s. But it's completely the antithesis of the classical, typical touristy idea that we have of Rome. So instead, what we have here is a sort of vaguely futuristic version of Rome, and also a version of New York City where it's possible for a man to ride down the expressway, the highway, on a bicycle. But they did it for real, so I don't know how the hell they pulled that off.
A couple of things mentioning that. You bring up the homeless people, but he managed to incorporate a couple of homeless people in this film, especially the daytime attack, which is so over the top and insane, or unsane, if you will. And then at one point there is one in the parking garage digging through something, and everybody's so high class and dressed so nice in this that when they actually do portray homeless people, they almost seem like animals or monsters of sorts. Maybe they're mutants from the nuclear or illness that partook the world previously. And mentioning that you said Inferno was not necessarily the big flop that it was portrayed to be, Daria Nicolodi seems to say stuff like that in the interviews with her. She mentions that a lot of Italian fans and some, I think she used American, were really kind of off-put by them not continuing that Three Mothers trilogy. And especially with the title Tenebre, you think darkness, Mother of Darkness, but that's not the only kind of little shout out to the Mother of Tears in here, as we know that one of the actresses who portrayed what would be in the third Mother is in here as well. I guess we'll get into that a little bit. So,
yeah, it's worth mentioning also when you talk about the homeless people. This whole movie is full of these kind of strange like class resentments and like gender resentments. I mean, everybody has like sort of a grudge against everybody else. But yeah, the scene where the homeless guy attacks the shoplifter is interesting because she's very well dressed. It's like everybody. This was during the time when Reaganism and Thatcherism, but like even Italy was trickling through where it's like, Dallas was on TV. There was this weird sort of wealth porn thing going on, but everybody in this movie is trying to look their best. They're trying to be very upper class and very well dressed. Even the shoplifter, she's like a strata below everybody, but then all of a sudden this homeless guy sees her and he just freaks, he like goes way over the top with her. But that's something kind of simmering through the whole movie. It's like everybody's about to explode one way or another. It's that interview with Mirella D'Angelo. It's something that kind of jumps out at me every time I watch it. It's kind of a neat little thread going through it.
Yeah, it's an aspect that doesn't get talked a lot about Argento because he's not explicitly what we would call a political filmmaker. He's not Elio Petri, he's not Damiano Damiani, but his films do have a kind of an ongoing social dialogue with regards to kind of the haves versus the have-nots. And very often what we see in his films are characters who are emblematic of kind of the upper crust of Italian society, but very often they're kind of rotten to the core. So there is this kind of weird back and forth that's going on, this sort of strange dynamic, and also gets into, sexual politics, sometimes explicitly, addressing issues of like misogyny, as is very much the case in Deep Red, for example. But also, it's very present in this movie as well. You get into that conversation between Peter Neal, who's being grilled by his friend, who's kind of a protege, who really comes at him. Nails out and really attacks him, for his hairy macho bullshit, which leads into this sidebar discussion between him and his agent Bulmer. They want your balls because they haven't any of their own, and so there's all this sort of strange stuff that's swirling around in the mix, and it's an element that I think because Argento makes these films that are very stylish, they're very entertaining, and they're very mainstream entertainments in a way. I think they very often aren't given the credit that they deserve for having other ideas bubbling underneath the surface. There's very often more going on in these movies than is readily apparent.
So if we were talking about this, I know this is like just a very generic kind of just description of it. So I one time was talking to, I think it was 42nd Street Pete at Wasteland. I just brought up Peckinpah, and I said, what do you feel about Gary and Billy the Kid? And he said, Peckinpah kills the Old West. Would you consider this Dario Argento killing the Giallo, or his version of it in a certain way? Because it is a Giallo, but it also is making a lot of statements on it, and it kind of reverts some expectations. You know what I mean? It does a little bit different things.
Well, I think after Deep Red, where do you go? Like, I always describe Deep Red as the Giallo to end all Gialli. It is the peak. It is the pinnacle. How can you possibly improve upon that? You can't really do that. So what do? You deconstruct. So I don't know that it's so much he's attempting to kill it, because that would be kind of against his own best interests. He wants to obviously continue to explore it into the 21st century, but he's becoming more playful with it in a way. He's becoming more He's engaging with criticism from the press in this movie very explicitly, which is something he carries over into the movie Opera. But what's interesting is that both in Tenebre and in Opera, and this is typical of Argento's kind of provocative kind of methodology in engaging with these criticisms, his on-screen kind of alter ego in both of these films is pretty awful. I mean, he doesn't really portray himself in a very positive way, if we want to look at it that way. Peter Neal, and obviously we're talking about this movie in depth, so I'm not going to worry about anybody being pissed off or spoiling it. He's involved in a series of murders. It's one of those giallo films where turns out not to be one, but there's two killers. So he's a psychopath. He's a sociopathic psychopath. And then in Opera, we have the film director, played by Ian Charleson, who is also, he's a little bit skeezy. He's a little bit sketchy. He's certainly not somebody that's, he is probably the warmest character in a very cold film in some respects, and yet he's not exactly the most flattering representation that you could find on screen. But yet, Lucio Fulci does something very similar later in Cat in the Brain, where he plays himself effectively as a kind of deranged, mentally just disconnected, sort of borderline lunatic. So I don't know. It's interesting that these directors felt the need to kind of represent themselves on the screen this way.
Well, and if you look at some of his, Argento said this in interviews, but it's really obvious if you read his autobiography and Fear. I mean, he's very open about what a neurotic mess he is. I mean, he talks about it through the entire book. It's like, I was freaking out, I was sleeping in the bathtub, da da da. I mean, he sounds like the hardest guy in the world to live with. So that's something he pretty much fesses up to in there. And yeah, and as far as this being the death of Giallo, though, I think we touched on this when we talked about New York Ripper, but this and New York Ripper both, I think, they hit around the same time, which is interesting because they're both embracing the slasher, which has sort of become very popular by them. But it's sort of like the old Giallo is dead, so now we're gonna you want slasher, we're gonna give it to you. Like Tenebre is still his bloodiest movie, just gallon per gallon. I mean, he's just like, especially the last 30 minutes. I mean, he's just pumping it out all over the place. There's way more nudity than he ever used to have. Same thing with New York Ripper. It was just like both he and Fulci decided just to go for broke and just like, you want it, we're gonna give you the ultimate. You can't get any higher than this, which in a way is still kind of the case. So I'm not necessarily killing it off, but yeah, it's interesting. This is kind of like almost 20 years since the Giallo really began. If you look at what most people consider the Evil Eye, Girl Only Too Much to be the first one, this is like the anti-Evil Eye, which is very travelogue Rome-y, especially the American version, has like all the sightseeing. It's very much like an American in Rome kind of thing. Tenebre is the opposite. The American comes to Rome. He doesn't want to see any of that stuff. He fits right in with all these Italians. It's literally just like the complete 180 degrees opposite of what Bava did in that movie.
No, that's a very good point, because the thing about The Girl Knew Too Much, which is a very playful, lighthearted movie, it essentially is kind of a Giallo comedy, which is interesting because you didn't really start to get into out-and-out Giallo spoofs until much later, which is what happens in cycles. Usually it kind of gets to that stage where it happens with the Westerns, it happens with horror films. You start getting into spoofs, and that's when the cycle is kind of coming into its death rattles, because it's getting to a place where you can't take it seriously anymore. But it started on a lighthearted route and then got really dark. And Tenebre, for as dark thematically as it is, it's an incredibly bright film. That's the contrast in the movie that's all the way through. The way Luciano Tolvoli shot the film is very, very bright. Even the nighttime scenes are just flooded with light, which is a very deliberate choice. But it does have a playful quality to it. As I said before, with the whole sort of deconstructing thing, I find a lot of funny stuff in this movie. I mean, it's not even unintentional funny. It's funny. And especially the relationships between some of the characters. Peter Neal is for as dark a character as he is, he's also very ingratiating the way he's played. We'll talk more about that, I know, but even down to the relationship between Giuliano Gemma's character, the detective, and his sidekick is really adorable. So there's all this kind of humor that filters throughout the movie. So as dark as the movie gets, it also has a kind of playful quality with it. So yeah, I think 1982, that was kind of like, that is the end of the Giallo boom. That is the end of the big classic Giallo period. We could take from 63 to 82. That's kind of the big period. There'd be a lot of good stuff that came afterwards, but I mean, again, how can you top that 1-2 punch? Tenebre comes out, New York Ripper comes out. It's like, and then, you have all that glut of slasher movies and everything else. I mean, it just indicated something had changed.
Yeah, by the time, we also should mention Pieces, although it's not Italian, so maybe it's not a giallo, but definitely we talked about those three movies having kind of the lean where they're giallo to slasher. And then by 87, if you look at Michele Soave's movie, I consider Stage Fright mostly a slasher film in the kind of aspect in that way. So we mentioned Gemma. And the casting of him is perfect because he was in all those spaghetti westerns and he's in the Dalamini movies and stuff where he plays such a good character. And he's also the complete opposite of a lot of the cop characters, you know? The cop characters in the Argento movies always like, hey, why don't you help me with the case? Unfortunately, he does the same thing here, but he's asking the killer to help him, and it kind of ends his life in that, which is so cruel. It's a very mean-spirited movie, as playful as it is.
Yeah.
Well, that's the joke too. It's the back and forth between him and the writer. You know, oh, I never guessed the endings of these things, but your new book, oh, I guessed it, on page 20. It's never happened before. So there's this joke that goes throughout the movie, and of course he doesn't see what's coming at the end, which nobody could. There's no way you could. I mean, it just, it doesn't exactly cheat, but it establishes something that cannot be disputed, which is that a murder takes place while Peter Neal's on the plane. It's impossible. He cannot be the killer. But then he fools you at the end. So there is that element that works really, really well. I mean, Giuliano Gemma was one of those guys who came from a background of, he was a stuntman before he got into acting and had appeared in some films in small parts like Visconti's The Leopard, for example. And he's all over the place in peplum films. He's very much a big presence in westerns. That's where he really became a big star. And I think he's one of those actors who, because he was so handsome and because he had such a winning kind of personality on camera, I think there was a tendency sometimes not to realize what a really good actor he could be. And if you look at him in this film, and I think in particular in a Damiani film he did called A Man on His Knees, which was only just recently put out on Blu-ray, boy, is that a good performance. I mean, this guy was a very, very good actor, given the opportunity.
And also worth pointing out that he was also really good with comedy, which is something people tend to overlook. But especially in the mid-'70s, he got cast in a lot. It was sort of like for a while there, if you couldn't get Terence Hill, you would get him. But he would play these sort of like slightly befuddled guys who want to be gangsters and, these sort of like hapless little schmoes. But he does the kind of like the confused quizzical thing really well, which does in Tenebre several times, where he's kind of like, like you said, the scene about guessing the killer in the book. But even at the end, when he delivers that speech at the end, how he worked out the murder, he still seems sort of like he's still doing it in his head, like he's still a little bit like not certain about it. But yeah, he's a really fine actor. I don't think he really quite gets enough credit because he had that matinee idol thing going for him. But yeah, he's really good in this.
I'd second The Man on His Knees. A Man on His Knees is just a really great film, and it's not really like a Polizia Testi or something like that. It's just a crime film in a way, but just crime drama. Just excellent film. Talking about Argento being so playful with the critics and stuff, and I just, that's probably my favorite part of this movie, because throughout the entire movie he's laughing at the critics, making fun of them. Violence doesn't, this media doesn't create the killer. The people who make this stuff aren't sick people, and then he ends up being a sick person at the end. It's just a stroke of genius to me. It's just so hilarious, and the idea, and I know I'm probably jumping all around because that's just the way my brain works, but there's one thing that I really like about this movie is the two different killers. Of course, John Steiner, one of the best to ever do the Euro crime film, worked with every great Italian director, horror genre director besides Umberto Lenzi probably, but he's just the reason for his motives and his killings, they have the same outlook. They look the annihilation, pure murder. What they want it to be done is something to take away their problem. When he's interviewed by him, when they have that discussion, he basically mentions deviant behavior, but Peter Neal kind of takes offense to that. He says, I didn't have these people die because they're homosexuals. That's not the problem with them. He's not worried about deviant behavior to anybody that does him wrong is the people that he uses murder for when he feels emasculated or taken it. And that's just a genius kind of way that, and it also plays into something that happened behind the set, right? When Anthony Franciosa was making out with Daria Nicolodi, he snapped, "Don't do that to my woman. You're going too far with it." And his Peter Neal came out in that moment, right? That jealousy, that rage. And it's just like, he is very much Peter Neal in kind of some weird ways.
It's a weird thing with the John Steiner thing, and I think it's probably because Steiner didn't do his own dubbing on the English track. The person who dubbed him was obviously decided to play him as homosexual. that just comes across in a sort of stereotypical way that and I don't know that was the original intention or not. So I don't know, was that something that was sort of baked into the script, or was that something, another layer that was added into it whenever this actor decided to give a rather sort of fey camp kind of line reading, because that's very different from the way that John Steiner would have done it himself, I'm sure. But it is this idea of, is this character Cristiano Berti, is he in love with Peter Neal in a sexual way, or is it just a hero worship kind of a way? The way that fans are with their idols. It's not always necessarily a sexual thing. They don't necessarily want to go to bed with them, although sometimes that's true. But it's they just adore their work so much that the line between what's appropriate and inappropriate is blurred, and so it gets into really strange stuff, which makes obviously Peter Neal very uncomfortable during the interview, where he's like, this is an afternoon show. Should we be talking about stuff like this? That's his way out of it. And the whole Franciosa thing, well, I mean, it's funny because Argento and Daria Nicolodi really weren't a couple anymore at this time. I think people tend to think that they were this kind of happy, functioning couple for a decade or more. That really wasn't the case. They had met on Deep Red, which was by far their happiest period of time. So from 1974 until really pre-production on Suspiria into 1976, they were indeed happy. They lived together. As Nathaniel mentions, Argento is very open about being very deeply neurotic, and women who have had relationships with him have talked about it as well. He can't tolerate sleeping in the same bed with another person. He just, when sex happens, that's fine, but then afterwards, leave me alone. I need my space and everything. And he has a lot of very neurotic kind of behaviors, which I think have gotten better over time, but certainly at that time were probably rather unchecked. And I think he was probably, not a terribly easy person to live with. They were never married. It's often said that they were married. They never were. He was only ever married once. That marriage had fallen apart after Four Flies and Grey Velvet, which has all kinds of personal stuff baked into that movie. So they really had their best period of time through the pre-production on Suspiria. Their relationship deteriorated to a point that during the making of Suspiria, he contemplated suicide. He was planning to kill himself at one point. He was in a hotel when he was over in Germany doing some of the filming there, and Dario had been with him with their daughters, and she just took the kids and went back to Rome, and he was so despondent. He did actually contemplate committing suicide. So, fortunately, that didn't happen. By the time Tenebre rolls around, they were linked so much in the Italian public's eye as kind of a couple. It was necessary to keep that going in the films, but you can kind of chart a progression in the decline in their relationships if you watch these movies. She's treated very well in Deep Red. I get the impression in Deep Red that originally her character was supposed to die, but then there was kind of a gratuitous bit added in. Oh no, she's going to be fine. It's kind of like, I can't kill her off. I love her. So that kind of is there. She's supposed to be in Suspiria, but she's not. Then in Inferno, she comes to a bad end. Tenebre, she doesn't die, but my God, the way the movie ends, and then we get to the movies afterwards. So any kind of, I think the jealousy on Argento's part was more to do with the fact that Daria Nicolodi and Anthony Franciosa were both very serious actors with a stage background, and they were kind of peers and they could talk to each other, and he didn't like that. I think he felt a kind of resentment because he was frozen out of that, because Argento at that time didn't really have much affection for actors. He regarded them as kind of a necessary evil. So they did indeed have a scene where they kiss on camera, and I think probably Argento thought, okay, that's too much. But it did spill over and create this kind of hostile environment. And to this day, Anthony Franciosa is one of the three actors he always points to as actors he loathed working with, the other two being Tony Musante in Bird with the Crystal Plumage and Christina Marcellak in Opera.
Oh, before we move on, I didn't mean that Bertie was a homosexual, although he's portrayed that. I meant when he talks about the homosexuals he kills, the lesbian couple. He kills them because they're... Oh, yeah, I just wanted them... I didn't want to be like that. But yeah, I just felt that to be such an interesting concept that Bertie related to the killer in the book, but Peter Neal is so far from Bertie as the killer. They're nothing alike. They have completely different motives, and that's just kind of like that worship of a person that he doesn't even understand any of it.
Well, also worth mentioning that Berti was his character is basically was triggered by an incident that Argento had when he was in America, that he had kind of a little stalking incident as well, which was something that was kind of coming to the forefront around that time anyway. Just in general, that's where we started hearing the term stalker came up around this time. But in a way, you can sort of feel the contempt that Argento has for that character, because it's sort of like, well, if I had a stalker, he's just he's just kind of a loser. But if I were going to be the killer, I'd do it spectacularly like Peter Neal. So
Yeah.
And you say the stalker stuff, and that's kind of obviously in the forefront, because we also have Der Fan this year, the German film, which is very much terrifying stalker movie. But where do we want to jump from here? Do we want to talk about the crew, the cast, anything else?
Well, I mean, in terms of the origins of the project, it's worth noting this is the first time that Dario's brother effectively served as the primary producer on one of his films, because Salvatore was starting to suffer from health problems. He was having heart troubles. So he was kind of sidelined during that time. And so Claudio Argento was really the primary principal producer on this film. And they don't have a very warm relationship. I'm not sure where it's at right now. Last I heard, they were going multiple years on not talking to each other. So obviously they've had a very fractured relationship down through the years, which is kind of funny because there is such a strong family bond within the Argento kind of filmmaking universe, with his father, his brother, his several of his different romantic partners, obviously his daughters as well. But it's a very dysfunctional kind of relationship that seems to run through very often, and unfortunately, the relationship with Claudio didn't always prove to be a happy one. Argento would kind of switch over to being his own producer for a period of time. Obviously, Phenomena, he would produce himself, and then go on, do like the Lamberto Bava Demons movies as well, and the Suave pictures and everything else. But this particular film was shot from the 3rd of May, 1982 until the middle of July. So it had a respectable shooting period of time. It was obviously a movie with a very healthy budget. Argento was not working on low budgets at this stage in his career. He had been very successful early on, so he didn't really have to struggle too much with low budgets early in his career. That came later. But this particular movie, reunites him with any number of fascinating people. In terms of the crew, we could certainly mention Luciano Tovoli, who's a great presence in Argento's filmography, in the sense that he had shot Suspiria, of course, his most popular film. Came back to do Tenebre, had been approached to do other films as well, including Inferno and Opera, but ultimately they didn't reunite until many years later for slightly less stellar film, Dracula 3D. But nevertheless, they've worked together at numerous points. And the big thing on this film, and in a way, I think the thing that really, it's almost like Argento made the film because he just so desperately wanted to use Lumicrane, which was something that Tovoli had used with Michelangelo Antonioni on a film called The Passenger with Jack Nicholson. Roman Polanski had used it as well on The Tenant to great memorable effect. So the famous sort of showpiece scene in the film, which starts with the camera tracking out the one window, going over the roof, it serves no narrative purpose whatsoever, but what better serves to sort of condense and articulate what Argento cinema is all about. It's just that big showy moment that just in and of itself is beautiful to watch.
The scene in the commentary with Kim Newman and Alan Jones had me laughing because he says meaninglessly brilliant about that cinematography, and I was like, that's the perfect way to explain that scene. But it's one of the most memorable scenes. I love it.
It's great. I mean, it doesn't, there's always this disconnect, and a lot of critics seem to have a difficult time with the idea of kind of style versus substance, quote unquote substance. Sometimes style is substance, and Argento is very much about those big moments, that this is what we remember from the films. And that's as valid as anything else. But very often a lot of people, like, what doesn't mean anything? It's really, really cool. I think that's what it comes down to.
I wouldn't say that it's meaningless, though, because it actually, I mean, a lot of people say that, but the fact that the shot starts off with the victim-to-be standing at the window, and it goes up and around, and it goes around over the building, and suddenly you see the killer from that same angle. But it's essentially telling you, like, everything in this movie you're going to have to look at from two sides. It's sort of saying, there's not just one killer. There's actually like two sides to everything. It's like just the perspective's going to keep changing on you. So it's sort of saying, don't rely on what you're seeing from this one perspective because we're going to keep flipping it around on you. So I'd say it actually serves more of a purpose than a lot of people say. I don't think it's some flashy music video thing, but it's not the first time either. I mean, Suspiria had that great moment, where the camera suddenly starts flying over Flavio Bucchi, in the square, which, again, it doesn't have any purpose narratively in the movie, but it's a really cool moment. Like,
it also sets the mood. It sets that kind of point of view where you really don't know. And it also plays out to the witches in Suspiria. They have point of view where it can go anywhere, but this killer's not the same, but it's still really cool. Puts you outside, kind of cold. That murder scene, that first one, not the first one, but the first one, woman Tildy who gets killed, the white T-shirt and that cut is probably one of the most brilliant murders or kills in any movie I've ever seen. Just the way that the blood sprays on the white.
Right. And again, it's a great example of what he does very well and what is true of a lot of Giallo films, which is getting away from, plotting sort of, pedantic reality and going for what I always say, things that don't necessarily make logical sense, but they make emotional sense. So she hears somebody hiss her name. Why does she all of a sudden take her shirt off, make herself vulnerable? It doesn't logically make any sense, but it makes emotional sense, and it is the perfect way to sort of cap that scene off. And it's an interesting thing because Argento is he's known for making films that are very bloody, and as Nathaniel rightly says, this was his bloodiest film up until that point. But he's not really typically a splatter type director. I don't think of him in a way that I think of like Lucio Fulci, who would get in sort of grubby and gruesome and chunks of things falling out of people's bodies and intestines. It's very aesthetic. It's very cool. It's very beautiful, and it's very deliberately stylized. Fulci's stylized too, but in a slightly different way. So you don't really get the arterial spray. You see the effects. The blood getting onto the wall, and you don't. It's not as explicitly nasty as some of the stuff that Argento would indeed do later. Some of his later films would become more explicitly sort of rub your face in it, kind of gruesome. Whereas at this time, it's murder as performance art. It's just something that he does extraordinarily well, and we see this in other scenes as well. Of course, the famous scene everybody remembers with the white wall that gets coated with blood. That's just his aesthetic, and in many respects, even if I prefer Deep Red, the reason this comes in, as a very close number 2 for me in his filmography is it is the perfect kind of representation of that stylistic approach in his films.
Yeah, compare that to like Mother of Tears. I just said, compare it to Mother of Tears, where he does do the Fulci thing with all the guts, and it's just not his thing. He doesn't have a flair for it.
No. Mother of Tears is downright ugly. It's not a particularly attractive looking movie, and there are scenes in that movie I don't find, in general, I'm not somebody who gets offended anyway, but there's stuff in bad taste in Mother of Tears. In particular, I know Nathaniel knows the scene I'm talking about, the scene with the White Witch, with her lover, the way that scene plays out. That's not interesting. It's not provocative in a really interesting sort of way. It's just, it's clumsy, and it feels to be really bad taste.
And also Tenebre is the first film where he kills off a lesbian couple, like we mentioned, the scene with the T-shirt, and obviously also the shot of her falling through the glass, which was, became the poster art. But, he does it in Trauma, and then he does it in Mother of Tears. But especially Mother of Tears, it's like, it has just a real nastiness to it that's not in Tenebre. In Tenebre, it's like, you as bitchy as they are and as dysfunctional as they are, it's like you still enjoy watching those characters. And in Mother of Tears, it's really skeevy. Like, it's not pleasant to watch at all.
No.
Yeah, the head through the glass also in Phenomenon. Like, that's his go-to, and Suspiria. Like, the back head through the glass is he does it every movie.
Deep Red too, yeah.
Deep Red.
But I love those shots. So we're talking about broken relationships. Of course, Salvador Argento would never produce another movie. He died in '87, a few years later for him. His brother, this was the last time he moved on. And he ended up producing like Santa Sangre, and you could see the visual appeal in that movie is amazing. Look kind of like an Argento movie at the time, but it's Jodorowsky, so. But he did try to bring back some people for this one. Of course, he tried to get Goblin to reunite, and it's only 3 members of Goblin, and they couldn't call it Goblin. He had previously worked with Keith Emerson, but since then, for Inferno, but since Suspiria, Goblin had broken up. So, the soundtrack is great, and it's very Goblin-like. Simonetti's in there, so.
Yeah. It's essentially Goblin. Most people would agree it's basically Goblin. You just didn't have a drummer. They had a drum machine, so there you go. One less person to get bitchy during the recording sessions. They did reunite many years later, almost 20 years later, for Sleepless, which was a very unhappy experience for them. And basically, that was the point where they said, "We cannot do this. We cannot do this again." They produced a great score for Sleepless, but they're credited on things like The Church and Phenomena, but it's not really Goblin. It's basically, because of the contracts that were in place, which I'm sure Nathaniel could talk more to that, a little bit more in terms of, the contracts that the various artists had with the different Chinovox and various different labels. They were able to use the name Goblin, but it really wasn't Goblin.
Yeah, Tenebre is as much Goblin as anything else that's called Goblin coming after it, if that makes any sense, which now it's confusing because now we have two Goblins. We have Goblin, and we have Claudio Simonetti's Goblin, which they actually did a tour, Goblin did a tour of the US, which they actually wound up breaking up during the process of that. But I think when they played the Egyptian Theater here in LA, that was one of the last shows where they really were Goblin with Claudio and the other members. But they did like a VIP signing thing, but you could tell things were not well. Like Claudio was obviously very pissy. Like he was not in a good mood at all when he was doing the signings. There was some weird riffs going on between all of them at the time, so it wasn't much of a surprise when they decided to call it quits. But yeah, if you follow them now, it's a little confusing because they both tour. So just be aware if you go see Goblin, which one you're seeing, because it's a little baffling trying to keep track of it. But yeah, this is basically a Goblin score, for all intents and purposes.
I've seen Claudio Simonetti's Goblin doing Demons, a live version of Demons, which was a hell of a lot of fun. I mean, obviously they know how to put on a show, but yeah, it's just, after there are other Goblin stuff too, which didn't involve Simonetti in between. So there were things like Boyo Omega and Contamination and things that that Simonetti had nothing to do with. So yeah, there were a lot of people coming and going during that period of time. It was very much a revolving door kind of group.
Yeah. If you ever get the chance, though, watching Simonetti do Tenebre live, though, because he does do it live, but it's really, really fun to watch because he's very open. He pulls out the little vocoder thing and he starts going power, and you can see him like do the voice live. It's really enjoyable to watch the way he does it.
The special effects artist is Giovanni Corridori, and I don't know much about him. I don't know if he's wrongly credited, but he's not like one of the big names. But his line of work is excellent, from Zombie to Contamination and all the Sergio Leone spaghetti westerns. So I'm just not really sure where the special effects guy fits in with the Italian kind of horror. But he's got a great list of movies, and when you hear it, you only hear the 2-3 same names: Overtrani and Del Rossi. So it's like, this guy did great with the special effects in this one, and Stivoletti, of course.
Well, interesting, it's not a prosthetic heavy movie, which is curious. If you look at, compared to like Suspiria Inferno, where you have a lot of flesh getting ripped, and in this one, like, you don't see that. And curiously, I'm wearing this shirt on purpose, by the way, but Tenebre is obviously also a bit of a response to Dress to Kill, which De Palma in turn, obviously he aped Tenebre very directly in Raising Cain and in Passion. He actually quotes shots directly from that, but yeah, it's interesting in Tenebre, like, you don't get shots of like skin being sliced open. You don't really get that at all. It's all just sort of abstract splashing, like Troy pointed out. That it is very much a sort of aesthetics. I mean, you do get sort of like the shot of the axe in John Steiner's head, but you don't really. It's just a cutout axe. It's not really an elaborate special effect. So, yeah, mainly he just needed somebody who could just pump blood as fast as possible. Yeah,
and it's apart from the arm getting chopped off, that's about as elaborate as you get. But for the most part, I mean, it's pretty basic stuff. It's very well done, of course, and it's always kind of state of the art as far as the Italian film industry at that time, which of course they were at the pinnacle really of the technical side of things. I think if generally people would argue that the pinnacle of acting in films is to be found in British films in particular. When it comes to things like cinematography, music, design, things like that, it's generally the Italians, and we can see that throughout this movie. It's a gorgeous looking movie the whole way through, but it has a very, very different style and a very different kind of atmosphere and look to it compared to the earlier films. Like I said, there was this rather perverse desire, first of all, to kind of confuse people right off the bat into thinking, oh, this is going to be another supernatural horror film, which of course it isn't. Although there are things in it that happen that make very little sense. So maybe it is. I don't know. It depends how you want to look at it, but it's also Giallo, so that's fine. but it's also for a movie that darkness, shadows, whatever translation you want to go with, Tenebre. It's very, very brightly lit, which you would think kind of, negates atmosphere, but it doesn't. It absolutely doesn't do that at all. They're tremendously effective suspense sequences, which also work because we like some of these sideline characters. There are a bunch of actors we'll talk about, I'm sure, who really are very, very endearing, and we hate to see anything bad happen to them. So again, for as mean-spirited as the movie is, it manages to create a lot of characters that are somehow rather endearing.
This is also like interesting, the third movie in a row where Argento, who's a very avowed animal lover, but this is his third film where like animals are like really pissed off and they just keep attacking people for no reason. So obviously you had the Seeing Eye Dogs of Spirit, but obviously the moment Daria Nicolodi where like every cat in the single building suddenly starts attacking her. But in this one, poor Lara Wendel is just like, we're just walking around minding your business, that dog just keeps chasing her over, which is a great set piece. But again, it's just like the entire world is basically just has some kind of strange vendetta. Like everybody just wants to go after each other. But even the dog is just like just so pissed off. But yeah, it's a really incredible sequence.
She shouldn't have kicked that fence.
Yep.
Maybe there's a rage virus and everybody's just getting over it. So everybody's gone nuts. In a world gone mad. This reminds me of the Dawn of the Dead trailer. In a world gone mad. Feel like I'm in it now. But is there anybody else we want to mention in the crew before we move on to the cast?
I don't think so. Not that I can recall. I mean, just to spend a word on the music, I guess, we touched it briefly, but what a great score. And Simonetti, of course, was, he was very much involved in the disco scene and the dance music scene. So this is Argento's most dance-friendly soundtrack until The Card Player, which is another Simonetti concoction, which has all kinds of really insanely catchy kind of beats going on in it, which are either wonderful or unbearable, depending on your point of view. There is a joke in that film where there's a piece of music that's kind of relentlessly going on in the background at the end of the film that's playing on the car radio, and she finally shoots the radio, which I think was a little joke there. But it's very catchy, and it's one of the everybody goes on about the Suspiria score, and I totally get it. I get it. It's a great score, but I don't find it to be as listenable as the scores to this film or Sleepless or Deep Red, for example. They get more play for me. The music for Suspiria is fantastic. There's no question about that. Within the context of the movie, it's extraordinary, and I do listen to it on occasion. I don't find it as fun to listen to, though, as those other ones.
I like it quite a bit, but actually my favorite track out of it is probably there's a really long track called Flashing, which is you first hear it during the scene with Lara Wendel getting chased, and it pops up again at the end. That's just incredible. The way it just builds and crescendos like twice. It's a really incredible piece of music, but I love it. I think this also has the distinction of being the only Argento score that was actually played as part of the Olympics. They did like a little tribute to the Italian Giorgio Moroder and all the electronic stuff, but they dropped Tenebre in there, which was kind of a shock, but it actually was kind of a chart hit in Italy, believe it or not. It actually, it was like a popular 45 single and did get radio play for good reason, because it is so catchy.
And it is a rare example, I think, I'm right in saying, of there being a repurposed song used in it, which had been in an earlier Goblin, which Dawn of the Dead soundtrack. There is a piece of music that we hear at the in one of the club scenes, when Hilda and her girlfriend are bickering. There's a piece of music there.
Although if you saw the U.S. version, you didn't hear it because they cut it out.
True.
Yeah, I was shocked when I saw the uncut one, because I saw the Japanese latest version. I was like, oh wait, that's Dawn of the Dead music. So.
Mm-hmm. I can't believe I didn't pick that up. Dawn of the Dead I've seen probably 500 times. Yeah, this people always call it disco-esque, and it is very much so. But this is so synonymous with horror for me that it sounds like scary. Like I get scared when I hear it. I don't think disco, But I guess we'll move to the cast. We should probably start with Anthony Franciosa, who is great in this movie. A certain demeanor about him. I like him. I like him in the movie a lot.
I think it's a very underrated performance, and one of the things that some fans are aware of, and they're always kind of like, oh, in an ideal world, he wanted Christopher Walken originally, which would have been really interesting, and I'm sure Walken would have given a great performance, as he always does, but I mean, he's just so inherently sort of weird and creepy it would have given the game away in a way that, in the same way that in Inferno, there had been talks of casting James Woods. It would have been too much. Like, James Woods is just too idiosyncratic for that very flat character. Even though I'm not crazy about Ly McCluskey in that movie, he's fine for what he's got to do in the movie. You don't want James Woods, he's going to upset the apple cart too much. And I think the same thing will be true of Christopher Walken. You just, as soon as he shows up, you're like, this guy's up to no good.
He's
You know, it's like having Cameron Mitchell or somebody, you know he's going to turn out to be the killer. So I think Franciosa, for all the problems that he and Argento had on the film, and there was no love lost there. I've never found any comments from Franciosa himself. I don't know if anybody ever thought to interview him about this film, because, in the U.S. it would have flown under the radar. So I don't know if anybody ever actually talked to him or not, but Argento has certainly made it very clear he didn't like him. But his performance is outstanding, and you would never guess that there was conflict. In the same way you wouldn't guess that there was conflict with Tony Musante, who gives such a wonderfully relaxed and charming performance in Bird with the Crystal Plumage, where I have heard things to Musante, which makes it clear that probably Musante was the problem on that movie. In the case of this movie, I think it was probably a little bit more complex. But Franciosa is obviously somebody who comes from the background with the Actors Studio. He's a very serious stage-trained actor, had been nominated for an Academy Award. So he was a proper actor. And during this period of time, of course, he's, his leading man days in Hollywood are kind of behind him. So he's starting to show up in things like, he has a kind of a pointless role in Death Wish 2. I don't even quite know why he's there. He shows up in a scene and you hear him on the radio a couple of times, and that's it. It's like, why did you bother? Maybe the part was originally bigger. I don't know. But I think he's outstanding in this movie. I don't think he always gets the credit that he deserves. Again, I think in a weird sort of way that idea of Christopher Walken just kind of gets people's imaginations going, which I understand because I like Walken, but I'm glad it worked out the way it did.
Can you
his
imagine?
His banter with John Saxon in this is wonderful. Like, John Saxon's character is he's almost entirely comic relief in the whole movie. Even his death scene is a punchline. So, but their interplay together. He's not in the movie a lot, but what they do together is just great. I mean, you love seeing the two of them together. I think Franciosa is great casting, and it works so well because it is such a shock when he turns to be the killer. Because when he goes crazy at the end, I mean, it's frightening. I mean, it's just terrifying. Just when he completely changes right in front of you. I mean, it really works. He sells the crap out of that.
Because you see the veil. When you have the dream sequences, you see the veil behind in shadows. You see the guy literally pulling his hair out, and then when he's in that corner like a little scared child and he's cackling, it's actually really unsettling, because somebody like that, a more masculine actor who's not certain of his craft, probably would be too scared to do that, too scared to look like that and do. They'd be like if you had Stallone or something, just for example, he'd be like, I'm not doing that. He wouldn't do it. He wouldn't do that kind of shit. But Anthony Franciosa is like this big masculine Italian guy, who's kind of a sex symbol. So him doing that shit was intimidating, as it's scary, like unsettling.
And to Nathaniel's point about the relationship with John Saxon, it helped that they were good friends. They were part of the Italian-American community in Hollywood, of course. John Saxon, his real name was Carmine Artico. So, he was well versed in the Italian film industry, and his, they had crossed paths many times and knew each other very well. So that kind of off-screen familiarity and chemistry was definitely there. So yeah, that was just perfectly chosen.
Before we move away from talking about Christopher Walken, can you imagine? It's like, when you eliminate the impossible, like immediately you're like, that guy's not like, it would be so good, right? But so bad at the same time. He's always that actor. It's like, well, they originally wanted Walken for this. I feel like Death Dream. They tested him out. Am I wrong on that? Did they test out him, or was it another actor they originally had for Andy and Death Dream?
Oh, I don't. You know what? That rings a bell. I think that could be true. I think that is true.
I think he was thrown out as a prospective person, but I don't think it went beyond like, oh, wouldn't it be great if Christopher Walken? Yeah, well, he's not available. So
speaking of,
Christopher Walken would have been like, it was like writing a book.
Oh my God! I just dubbed the whole movie. When we get AI far enough, we'll just do him doing all the lines in here.
There you go.
But, I also want to mention Julie Darling. He's in, which is a very kind of gross movie, but good movie, if you will, from 82. I think it's a wide release, but it's a good one where he plays like the father figure. We got to go into John Saxon now, is one of my favorite actors of all time. I mean, he's just got that great demeanor. He is the comic relief in the movie, and like there's just little dumb moments that they put in there on purpose to give him something to do. Because the hat immediately introduced when he does the thing like that's great.
Yeah.
But there's a point in the movie, which is one of the funniest parts, where he puts his hat on a cart, and he knows that cart's going to get moved.
Yeah.
He damn well knows that cart's going to get moved, and she comes and takes it. He's like, my hat, just so somebody else will acknowledge there's a hat on the cart, so somebody maybe a conversation. He just wants so badly to talk about this fucking hat.
I think there's I think I'm right, Nathaniel, you might remember better than I do. Isn't the hat also a reference to Foreign Correspondent?
Yeah, it is. Yeah, it's a little Hitchcock touch. And of course, John Saxon being the star of, as we said, The Evil Eye as well is a bit of a callback as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, he's one of my favorites. I mean, he was one of those guys like Henry Silva, who really, kind of had concurrent careers going in Hollywood and in Italy, and they would bounce back and forth, and they would do big films here, little films here, big films there, little films there. So Saxon's, I got to interview him. He was like the first celebrity I ever got to interview, so it was incredibly, nerve-wracking for me because I was a big fan of his ever since I was a little kid. He told a story about, being cast in The Girl Who Knew Too Much because he started off, he was kind of a teen idol type. He was obviously a very, very good-looking young guy. He was a big, strapping guy and very, photographed very well, had a good screen presence. And Universal was kind of making him into their next big, kind of Troy Donahue type thing, that he was going to be the next big thing. And he never really quite took off. And by the time 1962 rolled around, things weren't looking so great for him. And he said he was really starting to feel depressed. He felt like his career maybe was over before it really got started. And he got a call from Leticia Roman, who plays the girl who knew too much. And she was another member of the kind of Italian-American community in Hollywood. And she spoke with a rather strong accent, apparently. And she said, "Do you want to come to Italy to make an art film?" And he thought she meant an art movie. He thought, "Oh, I'm going to make a Fellini movie or something." He was all excited and didn't realize when he got the script, he said, "This is not an art movie." "Oh, it's a horror movie." "Oh, I see." So, but he had no idea about these people. He said when he went to work with Mario Bava, he had no clue who any of these people were. And he had a good time working in the Italian film industry. He got a kind of to a bad start with Bava in the beginning, but eventually they found common ground and got along. He said Argento was great with him. He said he called him Maestro, which was a sign of respect. So obviously he liked what he did. And Argento obviously liked him well enough. He brought him back later on to do the Peltz episode of Masters of Horror, which is probably the best thing he's done in the 21st century on the whole. Really marvelous little piece of twisted television. And Saxon is in that as one of the fur trappers. So I mean, he's just somebody who brings something. He never quite found that one defining role that made him into a major superstar. Probably the closest he came was something like Enter the Dragon, but it was Bruce Lee. So I mean, everybody kind of thinks of it as Bruce Lee, and they don't really tend to think of it as, John Saxon really was the star of the film. But Bruce Lee became like the big phenomenon. So Saxon was one of those guys who worked a lot. He's like other people we talked about, like Christopher George, worked a lot, always reliable, but never quite made it as a bona fide like mainstream movie star. But people like us always loved seeing him because he was always so good in everything he did.
Yeah.
I know that they mentioned that when they asked him about Tenebre, he's like, "I don't remember that movie at all." And people are probably shocked by that. But there is most definitely... When I was at Wasteland, I can't remember. This obviously probably 10 years ago or something. I am a big fan of Cannibal Apocalypse, and so I went up there and I was like, "Do you have anything to sign for Cannibal Apocalypse?" And he was like, he looked at me like he's like, and his like helper, and he was like, she was like, "He doesn't know what that is." And I was like, "Oh shit!" So I was like, imagine he had no pictures of it. He had no fucking idea. So a lot of the times in that early 80s gap, he probably just blanked all those fucking movies out of his head, or maybe he just didn't give a shit, but he's great in them. So I don't know, but maybe he might have had some, I don't know, maybe I'm just talking out of
Cannibal.
He might have had some issues. It had so many titles names too.
Cannibal Apocalypse was Apocalypse Domani in Italy, and I think he wasn't very happy about that movie. And Tenebre, he was probably on that movie for like a week.
Yeah. But it's just it was a shame because he did not remember. I had to get Nightmare on Elm Street, of course. You remember that one? I got that signed, but no, he's great in this movie. But you want to say anything, Nathaniel?
I was just gonna, yeah, he did have definitely some memory issues later on. So yeah, I think that also was part of it because he was so busy. I mean, bear in mind he was going back and forth between Italy and America. He was doing TV guest appearances like crazy. So things that he was only on for like you said, like a week or so or even less. Yeah, like even by that point, it's like it was just a huge like smudgy blur. Like he didn't remember a lot of them.
No, I met him. I forget what year it was. 2013, maybe. I met him at Monster Bash. Nice man. Got to meet him in person, shake his hand, etc. And we talked about Basil Rathbone because he did one of Basil Rathbone's last movies. So he remembered that. Planet of the Blood all the way back in the mid-'60s. But I think a lot of these Italian films were just a blur for him. And they were retitled so often. They were shot as one thing and they would come out as something else. And, I think it did go into production under the originally conceived title In the Eyes of the Killer. So he probably went, what's Tenebre? If he would have heard of it at all in the U.S., it might have been as Unsane. But like I said, he was on the movie very briefly.
Just to address where that title came from too, because we've addressed this before, but yeah, a lot of that confusion comes from a book called The Phil Hardy Encyclopedia of the Horror Film,
Yes.
where they didn't understand that like things that were used when a movie was first announced, like in the trades, they would announce it either as like a preliminary title, or they would say Tenebre, and then they would have like a tagline, would be Sotto
Yeah.
Same thing happened with Mario the Shock and several other films as well. But they thought that was the actual title of the movie, so it's actually listed as that title in the book, which is ridiculous and totally wrong. But yeah, and also that's also the book where there was a mistake where the original press book, it transposed the running time. They said it was 110 minutes instead of 101. So even now, some people may be confused. Will be like, "Oh, isn't there like 9 minutes still missing from the movie?" It's like, no, just a typo.
No.
101 is correct. That's the full running time of the movie.
There's just more homeless action that we're not being privy to.
And more doggy running.
A cannibal homeless scene that was cut out for whatever reason.
I'm here for it.
Do we move on from John Saxon? I guess we do Daria Nicolodi, who's a pretty big performance in this movie, although she wasn't really happy with it. She was originally supposed to play the ex-fiance, ex-wife. I've heard it said a bunch of different times, which is perfect, honestly, with what they were going through. But so yeah, she's just kind of Anne, the secretary, the helper, and she does a good performance. And she said it's a thankless performance, essentially.
Well, I mean, interestingly, on the English track, she's dubbed by a very big name, Teresa Russell. Funnily enough, I just revisited R.I.P. Gene Hackman. I watched Eureka last night for the first time in many years, and of course, she has a great role in that. So if her voice sounds familiar on the English track, that's why. Usually she was dubbed by Carolyn de Fonseca, as she is on Deep Red and Phenomena. So we don't get the usual voice we associate with her on this movie. I think it's one of those parts that on paper was not very appealing. You might wonder, I mean, it's a bigger part. Why would you want to play the ex-wife? She's barely in it, but the ex-wife's a more colorful character. It would have been more fun. Some sources indicate that there was also some talk of her playing the woman on the beach, which we will get to. I don't know that was ever really in the cards. She may have liked the idea. She may have tried to propose that idea, but I don't think that was ever seriously considered. They obviously decided to go in a very different direction with that. So, playing the ex-wife, yeah, that would have been fine, and she would have had the iconic death scene. But I mean, she's got a good chemistry with Franciosa, and I think she does a very good job. I think being that she was often in scenes where she didn't have a lot to do, she sometimes does do a lot of like mannerisms and things to kind of maybe try and stand out. So maybe that's part of her dissatisfaction. But I don't have any major problems with her in this. I think she's perfectly fine.
And she gets one of the greatest screaming scenes of all time. So,
Pretty much the only sole survivor of the entire movie.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Which is crazy to think. We already touched upon Gemma. I think it's one of my favorite performances. I think he's just incredibly likable in this and funny.
Yeah. No, I love him. I mean, Argento with police characters, they tend to fit into one category or the other. You have the kind of the more functional policeman characters like you get in films like Four Flies and Grey Velvet and Cat o' Nine Tails and Deep Red, or you get the more interesting, more rounded ones. And I always think of him in tandem with Enrico Maria Salerno in Bird with the Crystal Plumage, who brought so much to that character as Inspector Morosini. He's a lot of fun in that movie, and I think the same is true with Gemma in this film. it's that kind of Miami Vice era. So he's very cool, he's obviously very photogenic. He looks great. He's got all these great clothes. He's like, this is a very well-paid policeman. This is obviously a guy who isn't used to sort of tumbling around in the dirt with the criminal elements. But of course, this is a futuristic society where there's very little dirt. So there you go.
I guess Don Steiner, also huge performance in this one. Everybody knows him. He's in a million of these movies. He's worked with everybody. I think Caligula is one of the big ones, but he plays a villain like nobody's business. The Case is closed. Forget it. He's fantastic in that movie, and Goodbye and Amen. He's fantastic. Those are kind of some lesser talked about movies because they didn't really get wide release until recently here. But from his bald head, from Caligula all the way to this one, he's just tremendous. He's worked with all three of the big Italian directors, and Fulci, Argento, and Bava, so that's something to be impressed by. And he worked with Deodato as well, but he's really good in this. He's obviously the killer. It's so funny when the writer immediately knows he's the killer and has the interactions. And the first like appearance of him, he's in the background. And if you just pay attention to him this time, like when you watch it, you just see him. He's like just looks fucking mad from the first frame.
Well, it's funny how Franciosa points out, he's like, who's that weird guy in the corner, like staring at me?
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, but it messes with you because by this point, when you would never think, because it was sort of a trope at this point that the amateur detective was your hero. He was like your Tony Mazzante, your David Hemmings. He was the guy who walked you through the story. So you would think, oh, the amateur detective's going to be the killer. I mean, that was like a huge upheaval at the time this came out. So he's kind of screwing with you in a way. But yeah, you think it's John Steiner. I love telling the story. I won't tell it again, but when I was doing the special edition of Caligula back at Image, but I was trying to find John Steiner, and it turned out, oh, well, he just sells real estate over in Beverly Hills. He was actually like 15 miles from where my office was. So I basically took half a day, went to go see him around lunchtime, but hung out in his office. But he was a super, super nice guy. You can see the interview on the disc, but really, really nice. But at the end of it, he tried to sell me a house, and I was like, God, I wish I'd had the money just so I could tell people that I bought a house from John Steiner. That would just be amazing. But unfortunately, I didn't have $2 million lying around to buy a Beverly Hills mansion. Oh well. But I still have the calendar he gave me on the card. So. But he died way too young. He was hit by a car, tragically, not actually too far from where his office was. But yeah, just a great stage actor as well. I mean, obviously, in Great Britain, he was in Marat Sade, but very well trained. But he moved over to Italy, and he was in some sort of more higher tier films like May Morning. But then he would do Nazi exploitation. He had no problem doing that. But yeah, anything John Steiner's in, I think he elevates. But especially you mentioned Bava, but he's great in Shock as well.
Well, and that's the funny thing is that he made a joke about this later that he needs to be careful around Daria Nicolodi because every time he appears with her in something he ends up with an axe in his head. So he gets a pickaxe in Shock, which was Mario Bava's last theatrical feature as a director, and of course. Everything he did. I mean, he worked a bunch of times with Fulci, for example, and always enjoyed that experience and always brought something interesting to those characters. I mean, if he was playing a kind of, pantomime villain, he went for it. He was not ashamed to do that, but he also could play very sympathetic characters and more ambiguous characters like he plays in Shock, where you can't be sure for much of the film, is this guy up to something? Is he not? He does that very skillfully. But you can see him every now and again in British films. Nathaniel mentioned Marat Sade, of course, which is a great film, but also something really trashy like I Don't Want to Be Born, where he's the striptease club owner who's incredibly sleazy in that film. He just had that kind of look to him. A really good role that he had in a movie that doesn't get talked much about. It's a movie that Deodato did called Waves of Lust, where he is part of a small ensemble, and it's very much a kind of Polanski-esque knife in the water sort of chamber piece, with building claustrophobia and building tension, dealing with these two couples and the dynamics that are going on there. It's a really good showcase for him. It's a shame he's dubbed on the English track for this film, which is otherwise quite good. I mean, I think first of all, she mentioned Franciosa and Saxon. It is their real voices. The guy that dubbed Giuliano Gemma puts on a good accent for years. I thought maybe that's him. It's not his voice, but it's like, whoa, it sounds credible. So the English dub on this film, I think, is actually quite good. But in Steiner's case, I do rather wish he would have done his own voice for it. But you can't have everything.
Yeah, it's kind of like what happened with the first dub of opera, what they did to Urbano Barberini's character in there, where they gave him this very sort of fey voice for some reason, and people were laughing at it, and they're like, why? It's like, why do you think? It sounds silly, but Oh well.
It was Robert Rietti at first. He was him. He was a mrparka. Yeah. And he did some sort of strange. It was a very strange choice. But then they went back and gave him a very sort of bland voice. So I don't know. And it's all very strange. I mean, most of these films, the Argento films, work very well in English, and Tenebre is no exception. So if you choose to watch this one in English, you may do so without shame, because the English dub, I think, is very, very good.
No howlers in it, like you mean those black singers? There's nothing like that in Tenebre.
Yeah.
In Inferno.
Inferno.
When he gets on the elevator, he's like, have you heard of the Three Sisters? Like, you mean those black singers?
Oh,
Those
yeah,
black
that's
singers.
terrible.
Like, what?
I think there's a couple of funny bits in the club. I can't remember. Oh, you look like a turkey at Christmas time.
Yeah, it's like, Massimo, will you take my picture? No.
So Christian Balmero, we know from House on the Edge of the Park, big time Spanish actor. He also popped up in a movie that I think is underrated called Stigma from 1980 by Jose Larraz, where my 2-word review is suicide stare. If anybody's seen the movie, the end of that movie is just a brilliant kind of ending, where it's just very disturbing if you look at it. And he's also a Murder Rock, but I must admit it's been 20 years since I've watched Murder Rock, so he is not in my memory right now. But his performance is pretty solid in this, kind of as an innocent young person. He plays it better. I think he's more fit for this role than the role he is in House on the Edge of the Park, which I love, but I he's more fit for this. I think he's good as Johnny.
Oh, I think he's good in House on the Edge of the Park too, because he's playing this kind of yuppie, demonic yuppie kid. I find him very convincing in that one, but I like him in this too. The alphabet is his friend, because they went with kind of an alphabetical cast list after Anthony Franciosa. He's given sort of technically second billing in the movie, which is unusually high for him. And he shows up in a few other things. Murder Rock, you'll get an opportunity to revisit that. There are 2 4K editions of that coming out to look forward to, which is a very fun movie I have a great deal of affection for. But I like him in this. I think he reminds me a little bit of the young Udo Kier. Like if Udo Kier had dyed his hair blonde, he has that kind of look to him, I think. So very intense, sort of piercing eyes and very angelic looking. So, his features lend himself to playing like a nice kid like this, as well as sort of a demonic yuppie in House on the Edge of the Park. So I really like him in this. I like his interplay with Franciosa. He's got a lot of screen time in this, actually. So he's, and his exit from the film is pretty shocking as well, even though it's not gory. It's pretty nasty and unpleasant, because you really like this kid.
Yeah, and it's a haunting shot the way he dies when he's sort of staring right at the camera when he sees the killer's face. It's really well done. Something else about him, something that didn't really jump. I mean, it wasn't as dramatic to me until it's worth pointing out. There's only one uncut English language print of this in existence. It's actually over, believe it or not, it's at the Academy, the much big Oscars. Their film archive has the one print of this that was created to sell the film. That's where all those English language insert shots came from, the opening of the book and all that. But it pops up occasionally. But last time they showed it in LA was at the Egyptian Cinematic Void, ran it as a double bill with Dress to Kill, which is really fun. It was a total packed house. But every time Christian Borromeo showed up on screen, when you see it on a gigantic screen, it's really obvious. But he's wearing like literally the tightest jeans known to man. I don't know how they stitched those onto him. But every time they would like show him like from the knees up, people would just be like, because you're like, how does he even have any circulation? I mean, it's like the most obvious male camel toe you've ever seen. But it's like, I don't know how he could even walk around in those things. I mean, it's so uncomfortable.
I don't want to go on record not liking his performance in House on the Edge of the Park. I just think his look is more fit for this one. I do like it. I love everything about House on the Edge of the Park. But he's solid in this. And it is kind of the first depth where you think all bets are off.
Yeah.
Well, that's where it goes.
Yeah, that whole body count in the last 30 minutes, you're just like, wait, this movie is not playing by the rules. Like, I mean, there's like a death basically every 4 minutes almost.
It's a roller coaster of carnage after a certain point. I mean, in terms of, as vicious as the murder scenes are in Deep Red, the body count in that movie is relatively low when you think about it. There's not a ton of people killed in that film. Tenebre, when you get into that last act, it's just, bodies are over the floor. It's like Shakespeare.
Yeah, it's like, take that, Bay of Blood.
Yes.
I think we should talk about the actress who plays his ex-fiancée. It's Jane, right? What was her name? I know she had married to a big political figure in Italy. And her performance is solid, a little unhinged, but she didn't do too much work after she was married, so.
she doesn't do much in the movie. I mean, she only has
Yeah.
like about 2 minutes of dialogue, if that. But but I mean, a little controversial too. I mean, again, when they realized she was doing this gory horror film with her demise, I think, which again, if you saw the U.S. cut, was missing. For a long time. The first time I saw it was in Dario Argento's World of Horror, actually, because it was cut over here. But yeah, I can't even see Daria Nicolodi wanting to play that part though, because it doesn't really require her to talk about thankless. She doesn't do anything except, a couple of phone calls. That's it.
Make out with John.
She shows up at the airport looking suspicious, wearing dark glasses, and obviously photographed very well, and extremely striking. But she gets a little makeout action with John Saxon. Then she gets killed off. So it's a relatively very, very brief role. I think the actress's name is Veronica Lario, if I remember correctly, and she was connected with Berlusconi. So that was a big point of controversy for a very long time, which would take a whole separate episode to get into the particulars of that. But suffice it to say, Argento felt that very often when that scene was censored, that was because Berlusconi was playing unfair.
Yeah. As she says in the film, it all feels so sleazy.
That's brilliant. But Eva Robins. Now it's actually pronounced kind of like a Robert's Blossom kind of pronunciation. Is that my understanding? How she does Eva Robins with
with an apostrophe. Yeah, that's
apostrophe.
Yeah, it's kind of strange, and that's obviously kind of controversial as well. That nobody knew. That was like
Italian audiences would have known. Italian audiences definitely would have known that was a calculated move. American audiences wouldn't have known. I mean, people like us would be aware, but in terms of like the mainstream, not that this movie had much of a mainstream, but they wouldn't have known. It's the kind of thing that would freak out homophobes in the audience when they realized, oh my God. What am I looking at? This makes the film very current in terms of some of the stuff that's going on these days. She was a very, very well-known transsexual performer. The two big transsexual performers in European cinema were her and Ajita Wilson, and they had worked together on films in the past, including Ava Mann. So that was no secret. That was well known in certainly the Italian marketplace. I would assume probably most of Europe was aware of that. To a certain extent, but the American audiences wouldn't have been aware. So it's one of those things like, I think for a long time, a lot of the American writers talking about this would say, well, it's not like, they expected people to pick up on that. No, he expected people to pick up on that. It's just, it depends on which marketplace you were in.
Yeah. And I mean, this is also like the year after, for example, there was a trans performer was also one of the Bond girls in For Your Eyes Only. As well. So this was something that was kind of starting to happen. But also, I mean, even in Italian and theatrical pornography, they were turning out. It was really common. We'd have either trans performers or even you have bisexual scenes and things like that. It was way more common. They were kind of like in a way like what's going on in Brazil, whereas in America that was way less common. I mean, like almost never. You have like a very rare examples where they would try it. But yeah, in Italy, of course, they would totally know who she was. But even if you don't, if you're an American viewer, when she pops up on the beach, you're just like, there's something off here. Like it feels very strange. You can tell something's off kilter there.
Her walk when she's angry definitely gives me like that kind of vibe for sure. I really love the idea that it's very similar to Pieces, right? How our killer has that puzzle, kept the puzzle. Peter Neal here kept those red shoes and kept them in prestige fucking quality to send to his ex-fiance to mark that kind of recreation of that murder, which shows how deranged or insane Peter Neal truly is.
Yeah. We should mention, since we're going back to the crew for a second, but also the fact that Umberto Bava and Michele Soavi were on the set of Umberto's. But you see Michele for a second; he's in the party scene as well. He's you just see him for a quick flash, and
he's also on the motorcycle.
He plays. He's on the motorcycle. I think he's also with Eva Robins at the poolside. He's walking with her poolside. So he plays technically three parts in the film. Umberto plays a elevator repairman, I think. You get both of the assistants. Lamberto had been the assistant on Inferno. He started off as the first AD on this film, but then he was called away. He had to leave the film, so Michele Soavi kind of stepped up, and there's that whole sort of filmmaking family atmosphere that's going on. But it is an aspect of the film, the casting of a transsexual, which is something Argento likes to play around with, which is kind of gender fluidity and sexual fluidity and everything else, which is very much a part of his films. And it's, again, something that isn't always talked about. Once you get past the kind of very sissified I'm not racist, for heaven's sake, antiques proprietor in Bird with the Crystal Plumage, which is very, sort of very, very stereotypical. After that, you start getting much more nuanced and much more interesting depictions of kind of gay and lesbian characters in his films. It's all over the place. I mean, whether it's addressed or not. I mean, Miss Tanner in Suspiria is coded to be a lesbian. I mean, there's no question about that. But the character of Orosio in Four Flies and Grey Velvet was wonderful. But of course, he also even wanted to have a gay protagonist in one of his films, and his father was just like, no, that's too much. No, nobody wants to see that yet. So he kind of got talked out of that. But it's always there in the films, and even down to the casting of Geraldine Hooper to play Gabriele Lavia's boyfriend in Deep Red. It's like you're casting a woman as a man, putting a little cheesy mustache on and everything, and it's creating this sort of strange, weird, nebulous atmosphere. And the casting of a transsexual performer, no, it's not explicitly stated in the dialogue that this character is meant to be trans. But if you're aware of that, it kind of gives you a different reading in terms of what is going on with Peter Neal. What is it? Was it some sort of sexual trauma, insecurity to do with yearning for a transsexual person? Is this somehow bubbled into some sort of resentment and it's coming out? But yet, like you said earlier in the film, when the idea is presented that the characters are deviants that are being killed off, he really bristles at that. Like, no, he's a good liberal. He's a good, kind of progressive. But he's also a sociopath and a murderer. So there's all this kind of weird stuff that's going on in the film that isn't explicit, but it's definitely there.
And it's one of the few films where Argento actually name checks, religion, right? The whole thing about, I was brought up as a strict Catholic, weren't you? And he's like, yeah. So that's always kind of in the background because, Tenebre obviously is also a Catholic ritual. It's where you go around and, put up the lights in the church. But yeah, that's kind of a thing as well. It's like the sort of like, you don't stand a chance when you're a kid, and this is being sort of drilled into your head that you're always going to have this kind of weird, like, mental condition, basically. You're going to have some kind of sort of self-loathing or guilt sort of like baked into you.
You can definitely say that the whole movie takes place in darkness. Well, just the moral compass of everyone now is in total darkness. And although the movie's brightly lit, you could go down that rabbit hole for hours and talk about that. But there's a couple kind of smaller roles in here. What you mentioned, I hope I get her name right. She pops up in House by the Cemetery. What is that? Ania Pieroni?
Ania Pieroni.
Yeah, and she's also in, of course, Inferno. Third Mother, which is a brilliant casting to kill her right away. Like, hey, this isn't the Third Mother's movie.
Yeah. You put Middle Tenebre in Tenebre.
Yeah, exactly. Which again is very on point with the playful nature of the film. I think he intended to bring her back to play that character if they had made the Third Mother film in the 80s, which was mooted for a while. But by the time it happened, obviously enough time had passed, and she's basically been retired from films for years and years anyway, so that obviously didn't happen. He went with a very different decision, but perhaps emblematic of the times in which that movie was made. A very plastic alternative was found, let's say. But no, she's a lot of fun in her role. Actually, the store detective is worth noting is Ennio Girolami, who is the brother of Enzo G. Castellari. Big Italian director and part of that filmmaking family. The uncle is Romolo Guerrieri, who's directed a number of really fine films, and the father, Marino Girolami's guy, directed films like Zombie Holocaust. So he's the guy that she's talking to him. She says, "Oh, you're not gay, are you?" That's that scene where he's all his moral compass is screwed up too, because obviously she's attractive. He's gonna, I'll let you go, okay, yeah, because he wants to fuck her. So there's that whole thing that's going on as well. So, but there are innocents in the film, even in their own sort of strange way. I mean, certainly the character of Gianni, who we mentioned, is an innocent. We see what happens to him. Basically, the Lara Wendel character is an innocent, although she has this kind of weird little freak out with her boyfriend, which goes into the whole dog attack scene we mentioned. So we do get some glimpses of people who are basically okay, but for the most part, we're treated to characters who are flawed. And Ania Pieroni is I think very effective, and she has a very good death scene as well, with the pages being stuffed into her mouth, and again, not the emphasis on seeing a prosthetic throat being slit, but the blood and everything. It's the blood on the pages and the staring eyes. It's very, very effectively done.
Before we move on from Ennio Girolami, I want to mention he's the only poor son of a bitch that I can think of that's been killed by the last shark and the killer crocodile. So, but he's always, every time I see him, I was like, that's the guy who gets killed by the last shark and the killer crocodile. I forgot he was in this. When I saw him, I was like, what the fuck? I read in your book, and I did never put those two together that he was related to Ennio Castellari. I was like, what the? That's fun.
Yeah, no, it's a big, like the Argentos, it's a big sort of filmmaking dynasty in the Italian film, and it doesn't get talked about as much, but yeah, they're all, and it's Enzo G. Castellari, it's Girolami, so, it's obviously, it's one of those things, it's, once you know it, you start spotting them all the time, cropping up in each other's movies and things like that.
And became a joke in Inglourious Bastards as well, but that's another subject.
True.
And I guess the last person I want to mention, if you guys haven't one else, is I never knew this guy's name until this movie, but I recognized him right away, and I said, I did not remember he was in this. Just spots, Gianpaolo Saccariola, who, tiny, he plays the mortician.
He has the little
casting.
He has the little weird sort of foot fetish moment, doesn't he, where he's like wiggles the corpse's toe. Which kind of implies some sort of skeeziness going on there. Yeah, he is. He's Arthur in House by the Cemetery, and not House by the Cemetery, but the Beyond.
Yep.
And he's the sort of weird guy in the library, along with Carlo Di Meo is another weird guy in the library in House by the Cemetery. So, yeah, Argento was pulling from the Fulci casting pool a little bit on this movie, and indeed would continue to do so. And I've already done it. Veronica Lazar, wow. She hadn't been in House by the Cemetery yet, I keep getting these movies mixed up. She hadn't been in The Beyond yet, but she had been in Inferno, and then of course she would come back and appear in Stendhal Syndrome in a scene that was actually cut from the American release for many years. Little tiny appearance. So yeah, it's fun to see him, and that's again nice little sort of morbid touches introduced to a scene that could have just been ordinary filler.
Yeah, we should also mention, since we brought her briefly, but I think Lara Wendel's also worth a shout out because she was a fairly well-known person at the time they made this. We're talking this is a very meta film. It's very much about sort of crime films and crime fiction, things like that. But there's also a meta moment with her. At the time, she was kind of notorious. She'd done a film called Ring of Darkness, which involved some kind of sketchy nudity, but she was really notorious for a film she called Mal'Adolescenza with Eva Ionesco, who was probably the most infamous, extremely underage nude model because of her mother. That's a whole saga. There's a whole movie they made about her. But Lara Wendel's also had a lot of nude scenes in that as well. But that's a film that's basically banned pretty much everywhere in the world now for obvious reasons. But there's a moment in here when she comes in to fix to do some repair work in his hotel room. And Tony Franciosa leans over and is like, that's jailbait. That's jailbait. So that's what that joke is about when he's looking over at her. Because she was known for that. Argento's sort of like saying,
Yeah. Well, the weird thing, Ring of Darkness has never really come under as much scrutiny, and that's one of those weird fractured shoots where part of the film was shot when she was really underage, and the other part was kind of like right on the line, I think. So that movie has never really disappeared from view. It has a really distinguished cast. There are a lot of great actors in it, like Frank Finlay and John Philip Law and Valentina Corteza and Anne Haywood. I mean, it's a really pretty stacked cast. Ian Bannon. Really distinguished people who probably had no clue what they were getting into when they signed on to do this movie. It was pretty grubby and sleazy. She's quite good in this. Of course, she shows up in a bunch of these films. She's an actress, even if she's not a huge name. She's somebody that once again, we always enjoy seeing in these films, and I quite like her in this. I think she's very effective, and again. There is that real strong sense of a loss of life when she gets killed. It's a pretty brutal scene with the axe chopping into her. Very basic effects, but very simple. And I think that works really, really well.
And she also has appeared later on Argento's TV show Giallo, if you have that box set, the deep cut set. But yeah, she had a really super fun appearance on that as well. She's really like a very lively person. I mean, she did a lot of Italian sort of TV appearances anyway. She was in later for that, but really solid actress.
Later did Ghost House for our friend Umberto Lenzi. Had quite a substantial role in that. So if you like her in this, check that one out as well.
Yeah, I think I'm good on the cast. I do want to mention, I didn't know the actress, but I think she does a pretty good job in here. It's slightly a thankless role, but she does have some funny back and forth with Gemma. Carleta Stagnaro. The line in here that got me to laugh is when he said, "Why did they give me a female partner?" And he says something along the lines, "Well, they gave you a male partner, you have nothing to bitch about." And then I was just like, it's such a funny line.
She has the great bit where they're at the TV studio and she says, "Oh, it's Yves Montand. Oh, he's smaller." I love that. I think that's just so cute. Yeah, she doesn't have much to do really, but I mean, again, she fits into that finale because it's a whole doubling thing that goes throughout the movie, and it's sort of twinning effect, which again is very much also present in Deep Red for sure. There's a lot of echoing, rhyming patterns that go throughout that movie, and that repeats here. So she looks a little bit from a distance like Daria, the way that Daria has her hair in that film. So there's that confusion, which causes her to become collateral damage, which is so mean because she's such a lovable little character.
Yeah, felt bad for her. And then you're talking about the duality and stuff like that. Like you see Peter Neal in the shadows and the darkness when he's crying after the dream and stuff, and then it gets unveiled. Like I said, there's a lot of stuff. Like we were joking about how people write things about movies and make these things in a lot of films that it's not there. Tenebre has a lot of the stuff that you could sit there and dig and write all these film analysis and stuff about it. I think it's a very deep, interesting film.
I'd say that's true of Argento in general, and I'm sure Nathaniel would definitely agree with me there. It's it depends on the film. It depends on the level of intent and everything else, and the level of intelligence behind it. And Argento is a very, first of all, he's a very film savvy filmmaker. He comes from a background as a film critic. He worked as a critic for a number of years, and his movies tend to be very richly layered. I mean, not to say they're all masterpieces, but they definitely very often have a lot more going on than is immediately apparent. So when people want to talk about kind of gender politics and sexual politics and so forth in his films, I think there's a lot of interesting stuff to be said there. It's when they start getting into certain other films, I'm like, I think you're giving this way too much credit.
The gender politics of Claudio Fragasso, but yeah. Tenebre just confronts it head on. I mean, it's very direct in the dialogue, that it's very open about it. Which I was kind of disappointed actually when they ran this on The Last Drive-In with Joe Bob Briggs. They showed it, which they do a great little parody in the studio where they take the limo crane. They have the camera crew like doing the little the arm splatter. But then Darcy the Mail Girl says, Argento's a brilliant filmmaker, but he also objectifies the killing of women. And I'm like, yeah, that's not the point that's literally the opposite of the point of the whole movie, because he spells it out for you pretty clearly. Because women are the first third of the movie is women getting killed, and all of a sudden it flips it around, and then it's like, no, that's not what this is at all. And it's all deconstruction of the whole like misogyny accusations that were going on against these kind of films. I mean, right. Argento liberally facing it head on. So it's calling this misogynist film is missing the point.
It is absolutely, and it's something that's it's low hanging fruit. It's an obvious thing. Yes, you can attack. And this is the giallo in general. You can attack these films for, relying too much on the objectification of women. And there are misogynistic giallo films I could point to. I would point to things like Giallo in Venice or Strip Nude for Your Killer, for example. I think those movies definitely are rather icky. But Argento's films, Bava's films, Fulci's films, for that matter, very often have more depth and a lot more complexity going on than is very often the case. I think the thing that Argento did, it didn't do him any great favors, is Argento is a very instinctive artist, and I don't think he's very comfortable with analyzing his own work. So, for example, years and years ago when the movie came out on Rhone Group Laserdisc, I was so excited. Argento's doing a commentary! And then I tried to listen to the goddamn thing. I was like, oh, this is painful. It's just, he insisted on doing it in English, which he can speak English, but he really should have done it in Italian. It would have been easier. They could have subtitled it. It would have just worked so much better. But he insisted apparently on doing it in English. I guess he really wasn't very well when he did it either. He had a bout of the flu or something, so he wasn't feeling that great. So he did this one in Phenomenon. It was like, oh my God, this is just, it's so awkward. And it's like, he doesn't always know how to articulate what it is that his films are about. I think he just wants the films to speak for themselves, which is fine. David Lynch was kind of the same way. But he made that comment, that very infamous comment, well, I like beautiful women, so if I want to see somebody getting slashed, I want to watch a beautiful woman instead of an old woman or an ugly man. You didn't really help your case too much there by saying that, but no, the films do speak for themselves, and there's the idea that his films in particular are somehow misogynistic is not supported by the evidence.
I don't know how much weight there is and who the killer is in a movie, if that proves any points, but it's very much not usually a man. doing the killing. If you look at this, and maybe somebody could turn that on its head and say, well, he's portraying women as evil and murderous and then whatever. But regardless, it's a lot of times women killing men, and they usually, most of the time, it's a lot of people that are suffering from some sort of mental illness or something that triggered the mental illness, creating art. And we get into the last point, I guess we'll say, like, I've seen a lot of people making the comment that, Peter Neal's killed by a piece of modern art, which is kind of funny in itself, at the end, being killed by a piece of art,
Yeah. Well, a very painful scene.
Yeah.
Which, weirdly, Kenneth Branagh tipped his hat to in Dead Again, which was kind of a surprise.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think it's less about gender, more the fact that if you look at all of his, almost always the killer in Argento's films is being driven by some sort of childhood trauma. I mean, it's in Crystal Plumage, it's in Four Flies, it's in Deep Red. I mean, it's in this. But yeah, it's whether you're a man or a woman. It's like if something happens to you that sort of like breaks your psyche as a kid, the kids are basically victims in his movies, and that abuse cycle sort of continues, and that's how they become killers. That's much more common than saying male versus female.
It's Sleepless
well,
as
you
well,
get something,
I think.
Sleepless,
you get something like Cat o' Nine Tails, which is a little bit different because that's a different kind of modus operandi there, but mostly it is rooted in childhood trauma. And of course, appropriately enough, he used the title trauma later, which he could have used for just about any of his films.
Yeah.
So very often that is absolutely true. And yeah, sometimes you have the women as the aggressors, sometimes as the villains, sometimes as the victims, sometimes in heroic roles. It just depends, So I don't think that, I don't think that it's as cut and dry as all that, as so many people want to make it out to be. That wow, this film features women, beautiful women being killed. Well, yeah, but I mean there are also men being killed as well. And that scene at the end with Peter Neal's demise. I think the most difficult thing about that scene is the sound effects of his hands slippery with blood, just squeaking on that. He's trying to grab hold of it. He can't. That just makes me cringe every time I watch it.
Yeah, it really does. I mean, a lot of guys die in Tenebre too. I mean, I think people tend to forget about that, but it's like, I mean, every single male character aside from the very teeny tiny peripheral ones, like the homeless guy lives, but but yeah, like every man in the movie winds up dead at the end of it, which is worth pointing out.
I do find it funny in Cat o' Nine Tails because it's not really the same motive, but it ends up becoming the same motive because once the killer realizes if that information gets out, they're going to say that you're crazy. So instead of just saying that's bullshit, he carries on a murder spree to cover up that he might possibly be crazy, therefore fulfilling the prophecy that he is fucking crazy.
Yeah.
Well, and that rather neatly gets around, and it's something that I think Maitland McDonough was the first person to point out, talking about the film, because not to get too far off topic, but that movie relies on a piece of scientific information that has since been majorly discredited with regards to chromosomal imbalances and what they used to refer to as mongoloidism, which had been adopted wholesale in the film Twisted Nerve, which is the film I like. I think it's got a lot of good things going for it. It's got a great Bernard Herrmann score and a great cast, and it's an interesting film, but very, very problematic. Whereas Cat o' Nine Tails, it's not the genetic abnormality that is the reason. It is actually the fear. It's the knowledge that, oh shit, I've been researching this thing and now it turns out I've got the same. So I've got to, dig myself out of this hole, getting blackmailed by this one guy, and this is leading to a chain reaction of murders that goes on. So it's kind of a fun way of avoiding buying into a piece of faulty scientific research.
Yeah, his whole motive is just covering his butt, basically, which is all it boils down to. Well, and in Cat also you have the whole like that quasi-incestuous thing with Catherine Spock as well. So there is a childhood trauma. It's just not the killer. It's someone you think is the killer, and it turns out not to be.
Yeah.
So should we go to like the release of the film and how it was the reaction by critics and everything that?
I mean, it came out in October of 1982 in Italy, and it came out it's the same time frame as E.T. So no second no prizes for guessing what came in number one at the box office for Italy and anywhere else in the world, 1982. But it ranked number 12 at the Italian box office for the 1982 to 1983 season, which shows you Argento from the 70s into the 80s was at the top of the pile commercially at the box office. His films routinely did extraordinarily good business at the box office. It wasn't until he decided to go to America and try his hand at doing films in America that his grip was lost, unfortunately. And he had a string of films that didn't do very well, including Michele Soavi's The Sect, which was not commercially successful. So that led into problems later on. But this movie was very well received commercially. It was enormously successful. In the UK, it was released in 1983. They cut it, obviously, for theatrical release. This shouldn't be surprising. BBFC was always getting their scissors out for Argento's movies, and that was the only version that was available in the UK until 2003. It took him until that time to get the movie uncut in the UK because it was on the Video Nasties list from 1980, I want to say 1984, all the way to 1999. So for a long, long time, this was a movie that was very notorious in the eyes of the British censor, as was New York Ripper, which is a far more incendiary film than this one, I'd say. Didn't come out in America until 1984 through a small company called Bedford Entertainment, who put it out as Unsane, trimmed some footage from the film, I think about 10 minutes altogether, and slapped a Kim Wilde track onto the end titles, which is a very catchy tune. I like it, actually, but I don't know that it really fits into Tenebre, although, I don't know, it's not as inappropriate as all that.
But yeah, that was off of her second album. It's called Take Me Tonight. It's a great song. That was the way I first saw it. But yeah, it's I actually have a back when I was in college, I bought it. I still have it stored somewhere, but I had a big British quad poster. But the funny thing is, not only did they censor the movie, but on the poster, if you know the original theatrical art,
the ribbon,
it's one leaning back with like a string of blood. In the UK, they turned it into like a red ribbon, so it suddenly turned into like Sidney Sheldon's bloodline. Go figure. But that was also for some bizarre reason they actually released a vinyl soundtrack at the same time in the UK, but that was much easier to import over here than the Italian soundtrack was. So that was the first time that I got it. Was actually the UK album with the ribbon on her neck as well. But later obviously Channel Vox put it out on CD and it's been reissued many times since then. But yeah, as you said, the VHS, this was actually one of the first Argentos I ever saw because the VHS was pretty easy to find. This Crystal Plumage, Creepers, those were the ones you could find on the video shelves back in the 80s. But you could tell it was cut when you popped it in. I mean, obviously the limo crane shot, famously, there's that huge jump in the music. Which they've since replicated on the Blu-ray and UHD editions if you want to relive that for whatever reason. But you can hear like the skips in the music whenever they would cut the gore scenes or the limo crane shot. So it's kind of a confusing watch, but I still loved it the first time I saw it. And then watching the Michele Soavi's documentary, which has several bits that were cut out from that was kind of an eye-opener because then you realized how badly it was cut. And then we had the Japanese Laserdisc come out, which was complete. So yeah, it was kind of an interesting road if you're an Argento fan in the 80s, sort of like trying to see like what exactly is the full version of this movie, because it was kind of a mystery for a while, trying to figure out how much was missing from this, because the US VHS, it was like deep red, there were so many different running times reported and you really had no idea.
I wasn't really an Argento fan until the mid 90s. I got into I went down a huge rabbit hole in the mid 90s. I graduated from high school in 95, and I always remember that I took a year off between high school and college. And I was working, and my friends had all kind of migrated, and so I just had a lot of time on my hands to watch movies and buy movies, and I was buying, bootlegs effectively from Midnight Video, principally, although also Video Search in Miami was in that group as well. And that's where I saw most of the Argento films for the first time. I'd seen things like Suspiria and Creepers and Birds of Crystal Plumage. I remember renting those out and opera. But Tenebre I didn't get to, unfortunately, after I read McDonough's book, which is a wonderful book, but it's incredibly spoiler heavy. It has to be. My book is spoiler heavy as well. Like, if you really want to analyze the films, you can't be coy about who the killer is. So I knew all the endings, which was kind of a shame. I didn't get to see an Argento film without it being, unless we count the really early stuff, but later on, like something like this, the Stendhal syndrome. Although Alan Jones spoiled it in his review, so I just couldn't catch a break for years. I don't think it was until Sleepless, really, that I got to see one where I was really like having to work out the mystery the whole way through, which was no great mystery. But anyway, that's another matter altogether. But Tenebre, the first version I saw was the Japanese Laserdisc bootleg from Midnight Video, which was widescreen, and it looked nice and everything. It had the burned-in subtitles, of course, but it was uncut. Funny thing, it was for years, this was a very difficult movie to get uncut because every version was missing footage due to frame. It wasn't censorship as such. It was just all the prints being used were damaged. So when Tenebre first came out through, Roan Group put it out on Laserdisc, and then Anchor Bay did like the DVD and all these other versions for a while. They were all missing footage, and there was all this uproar online. I remember all these people being all pissed off because it was missing 20 seconds or it was missing 10 seconds or whatever. But all that was in the Japanese Laserdisc version, so I knew what was missing. Although different versions had different inserts, like Nathaniel said, with the the text, of the book or the notes, things like that. There would be an Italian version. There would be an English version, which is standard practice. Although in the case of something like Blood and Black Lace, I don't recall ever actually seeing any English inserts. It's always seems to be German. But in this film, yeah, exactly. What? But you know what it means. So Tenebre, that was my first experience seeing it. I loved it right away. I still think it's one of his best films. I know a lot of people rated this their number one, and I can't blame them. Deep Red is my favorite, but Tenebre is a very close number two.
I'd probably put this. What were you saying, Nathaniel?
No, I said it's hard to rank his stuff. It depends on your mood. Like, it's really difficult for me. But I'm like, what about you?
This one's my favorite. And I guess I had the connection to it. And I probably saw this one. I think I had to see it when the DVD was released. If it was on a VHS, it was probably an Anchor Bay VHS. Probably around like 13, 14 years old. This is the one I connected to, I think. Suspiria I saw first. But I think this one's way more approachable for somebody that's grown up on a lot of American cinema throughout their early, 8 to 9, 10, 11, 12. But no, I do want to say this story because it's probably the only time I'll ever get to mention it. I used to show a lot of these movies to my friends, and we were probably 20, and I showed my friend, one of my best friends, he's an average guy, but he has a little bit more open mind, so I showed him Tenebre, and we're watching it. And when he realized that Peter Neal was the killer, because he liked Peter Neal, he said, "No, it's not, is it?" He's like, "No, come on, it can't be Peter Neal." And then when he realized it, kind of like the detective, Gemma didn't want to realize that he was the killer at first when he realized it. But, you really don't want Peter Neal to be the killer because in a weird way, maybe more just average people would kind of relate more to Peter Neal in the movie. He's like their connection, their inside world. He's, I guess, what they look at to in the movie. So when he becomes a killer, you're like...
Could you imagine Deep Red, David Hemmings turning out to be the killer? I mean, what a different experience that movie would be. Yeah. I mean, and it's funny because as dark as the movie is, I always link this movie with New York Ripper for reasons we've already talked about. And it's interesting because, there's that confusion. Is the New York Ripper a slasher movie or a giallo? That never seems to be a question about Tenebre. It's always accepted as a giallo, even though it gets very gory. New York Ripper is always kind of a little bit controversial. Is that it's both, as far as I'm concerned. Same thing with Stage Fright. Same thing with any number of other films we could point to. They don't have to be just strictly one thing. But as dark as this movie is, I don't tend to think of it as being as much of a downer as New York Ripper is, but when you think about it, it kind of is, because the guy you like the whole way through turns out to be the killer, or at least one of the killers. Pretty much all the characters you like are killed. The one who survives is just a screaming, hysterical, sobbing wreck at the end of the movie. It's pretty darn bleak, and most of his films really are. It's very rare, and I don't want to spoil everything for people who haven't seen the other films, but usually the survivors at the end of the films, you get a sense they've cracked a little bit. Something's happened, and David Hemmings is staring into that pool of blood at the end of Deep Red. You don't get the impression he's just going to go back to playing with his jazz ensemble, do you?
Yeah. Well, Tenebre has that kind of that slickness and glossiness to it and kind of playfulness to it that New York Ripper does not. I think that's the difference. The tone of it. They're both incredibly bleak, but Dave, since you mentioned, I have a funny story on a similar note as well. Because back in high school, as soon as I got a job, my very first job that paid at a video store, I would import Japanese laserdiscs, so Tenebre, I bought right off the bat, things like that. Although I'm not talking about opera for some reason, it's my most watched Argento for various reasons, but I've seen it like probably 50 times for different reasons. But we would get together on the weekends and watch The Beyond or whatever. But I put the Laserdisc of Tenebre on to watch it, and the scene with the arm cutting where it sprang on the wall. But I had one friend; she would always come to these. But she all of a sudden she stood up and she was like, "Quick, write his name on the wall!"
It's like Deep Red with the steam.
Yeah.
Yeah, I used to have in college in particular, because during that period of time when I got really into this stuff. Most of my friends were off elsewhere, and once I started college, I made a new group of friends, and I used to bring them over to my house very often, and we would get together and watch a lot of these Argento and Bava and Fulci movies. And it was interesting how well they went over. That even though we were all in our late teens, early 20s, and it was amazing because they were so weird. That was the thing. They were so different from what you're used to. Even if it's like a murder mystery, It's not done in the typical way that an American murder mystery is done, and that just really seemed to win people over. I don't really recall any of these movies being rejected by the people that came over and watched them. I mean, they always seem to really appreciate them. So, they obviously have a very idiosyncratic quality, which isn't for everybody, but the people who respond to these really respond to them.
Tenebre is a great party movie, which New York Ripper is not. I mean, it's one you can just throw on with your buddy and watch. It's like you say, use the term roller coaster, which it really is. Which New York Ripper, I don't think you could describe it as that. I mean, you got to be really careful how you show that too.
I don't remember watching that with anybody. I think I knew better. I think that was one I was like, I would give it to people. I'd say, well, if you want to watch it, here you go, take it. But I didn't watch it with, I don't think I watched it with anybody.
I think Art would disagree with you guys about party movies since he's not here. I think he would definitely, New York Ripper is definitely a party movie for Art.
Art probably has necromantic dress-up parties to watch, snuff movies.
Well, is there anything else you guys want to mention?
No, just I mean, it's a great film. I mean, it's one of those films that its esteem keeps going up and up and up. I think the more that we get better versions of it. I mean, it's been a weirdly unlucky film for a long time. In a way, almost like opera, in that every home video version seemed to be jinxed in one way or another. I don't know if you ever saw like the very first Blu-ray that came out in the UK. It was just an abomination.
Oh God, the Arrow one.
Yeah, just horrible scan.
Tenebre? I remember. I remember it
being
shitty too. I said
the original Arrow release was absolutely and I used to write reviews. I'm not Mr. Mondo Digital, but I did for a period of time write reviews for DVD Maniacs and AV Maniacs and Eccentric Cinema. And I always used to cut Arrow a lot of slack because I really liked what they were doing. They were kind of doing special editions of these movies, and I was so happy. But all their early releases were screwed up in one way or another. But Tenebre was the one that broke the camel's back for me. That was the first one where I was really like, this is a piece of shit.
Color was
it
flat.
Looked awful. Totally
no
awful.
Color. I actually was watching it once, and one of my friends walked in, a different friend, and they said, it ruined the movie for them. They were just like, this sucks. And I was like,
some sort of weird hazy thing going on. I don't remember.
I guess in Italy at that point they were using these really awful cheap scanners. So it was called scanner noise, where it's like you had this weird blotchiness all over the screen. I mean, it was unbearable. A lot of the transfers back then were really messed up that way, but Tenebre was the worst. I mean, it was so just blotchy and pixelated. I mean, it was just an absolute travesty. It was worse than the VHS, I think.
Yeah, it was. But they redeemed themselves. They've subsequently did it over again, and now we have we've got two great 4Ks. I mean, they're from the same source. Obviously, Synapse and Arrow kind of pooled their resources, and we have these, two deluxe special editions out. Unfortunately, this means Nathaniel and I are unable to add this to our roster of Argento commentaries, but we've tackled everything on either side of it, so there's something to be said for it.
I felt, it does seem like it's missing. Like, I could have swore I would have picked it up and looked at the back and said commentary by Nathaniel Thompson and Troy Howarth.
I don't still available.
I don't want to dog Arrow because it's one of my favorite companies, but that I do distinctly remember that looking like crap, that old release. But that was what?
What was that?
15 years ago?
Early 2000s. Early 2000s.
Yeah.
It was awful. It was awful. They were all, phenomena. There was all kinds, because they used the longest Italian version, and they put the English track on, and it was just jumping around all over the place, so weird. And Ken of Nine Tails, and they did a version of Bird with the Crystal Plumage with Vittorio Staro's crackpot universum aspect ratio, where he decides all movies need to have this Last Supper aspect ratio, and it just looked awful.
Yeah, and it was all tinted blue for some reason.
Yes, tinted blue, and then the Beyond, they had the prologue wasn't tinted properly, and but God love them. They were doing something that was worth doing, and I did cut them a lot of slack for a while. But Tenebre, their original release, that was awful. But they did redeem themselves later on. Obviously, in the version we have now is great, and they have a really fun Alan Jones, Kim Newman commentary, which I thought was particularly good. And Synapse got one with Maitland McDonough, which I thought was good. And of course, they've also retained the old Argento track, which good luck.
The end, the McDonough, the end ties it around. I thought was really, really good because she was like one of the first people to write about Dario, right? The book and everything like that. Early, right? Watching bootlegs. Yeah, it's interesting stuff hearing that, which is and like a group you don't get to hear a lot of people from that heyday, original people on that stuff. So that's a good track. But I think I did the like the Newman, the one Jones best probably.
Yeah, Newman's always fun. I mean, it's just I don't know why he doesn't work by himself. I mean, I mean, no disrespect to Alan Jones in this context, just that Kim Newman has no trouble talking. He always has to have a partner, and I don't really understand why, because he just can go. But no, and obviously Alan Jones has his legacy of being on the set of not that film, but subsequent films. He was on the set of almost all of them, so he has a lot of kind of behind the scenes gossip to add into the equation as well. So it's a fun track.
He had my favorite line in that commentary. I told you about the meaninglessly brilliant, but he had one of the best lines in the Cat 9 commentary too, when he talks about, I can't remember the German actor who plays Mosquito the rapist, but he mentions in this film the signifying thing that you're gay is the inability to button the top 2 buttons on your shirt, and I laughed for 5 minutes. It's such a stupid fucking thing, but it's so catty but funny.
No. I can almost guarantee any Kim Newman track is at some point or another he's going to make me howl with something. It's just he talks on the Hammer Dracula. He's talking about Michael Gough, and he says, "Well, he's a bit of a plank." And the way he said that, I just lost it. I think it's so funny.
Thank you guys for doing this. Do you guys have any plugs that you guys have coming up?
Well, we've done some more commentaries together, lots of Giallo tracks. I think all of our Argento-related tracks are long out of the gate, but yeah, you can hear us on the Deep Cuts release that we put out a while back. Was the most recent one, I think. Yeah, plenty of them are out there, but yeah, lots more coming up.
The Forgotten Giallo Volume 8 set was recently announced. That we're in on that. Rings of Fear. With Eugenio Ercolani, and then Eugenio and I also did a movie with a title just rolls off the tongue. AAA Masseuse, Good Looking Offers Her Services. That's a title for the ages. But when people ask me these things, I have to be very careful because I can't remember what's been announced and what hasn't. But I can assure you, there's a lot of stuff coming.
All right, I appreciate it, guys. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You know, there's a sentence in a Conan Doyle book. When you have eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth.
Mm-hmm. The Hound of the Baskervilles.
Yes. You know, the impossible in this case is that the chain of killings doesn't make sense.